One thing you think about when you go climbing, whether it's an expedition or just a day going ice climbing, think about what gear you're going to take. And one of the first things you think about is the rope. And Nanga Parbat, Vince and I took a 8.1 millimeter by 50 meter rope, and that was our main climbing rope, which is pretty skinny. And then we paired that with a 5 mil rope that was 55 meters long. It has to be a little longer because this is a static rope and this is a dynamic rope, and this, when you rappel, stretches a little bit under your weight. So it has to be, this static one has to be a little longer to match the stretch of the dynamic one. So this 5 mil stayed in the pack pretty much the whole time. We used it on the summit day and then on the descent. But the rest of the time, we're just climbing on one rope, which is great because it's so much easier to just deal with the logistics of one rope with the belays and tying in and all that. One of the things you think about when you go climbing is ice tools. And on Nanga, I think in any alpine climb, it's important to have a selection of tools. You need to have an adze with you, I believe. You need to have, the rest can be hammers. And you need to be able to have, for me, I like to climb leashless. So I have these pinky rests on my tools. And the leader would climb with these two, and they'd have one big pinky rest on this one, and then one would have this sliding pinky rest that you can put up, and you can hook this over the top of the thing when it doesn't break like that, and you can then use the shaft to plunge into the snow. So that works good. And then for the second, you can have one real tool and one light tool. This tool weighs about half as much as this. Because you're seconding, you're basically on top rope, so it's okay to have like a little less secure tool. You don't need a real tool, so to speak. So, and then because of the leashless system, I'm attached to my tools with tethers with elastic cords. And I don't have one with me because I left it over there in Pakistan. Haven't gotten a new one yet. But that allows me the freedom of climbing leashless, but takes care of the insecurity of possibly dropping a tool on the route. One of the things you think about too is crampons. And I just go look for a really good all-around basic crampon for most alpine climbing. And then I do a few mods on mine. One, I take the center bar out, the original stock center bar, and I replace it with these spring steel ones that are lighter. And they're flexible, but they're more than half as much as, less than half as much as these. And then when we get to the climb, I'll take these clips out, these little spring steel clip, and I'll replace it with a nut and a bolt, because once I'm going on the route, I'm not going to be changing boots. I'm not going to need to adjust my crampons. So that'll save the weight of that little piece. And I'll also use a little super glue on that nut so it doesn't come loose on the route. And I'm done with that. I don't even take a little wrench to tighten it or anything. I just call it good. Then the rack. Probably the most important thing in pieces of rack on our route on Nanga Parbat was the ice screws. We use those the most because it's mostly an ice climb. And we have 5 screws, 3 of the shorter variety, which are great because most of the time you're putting the screws in really good, hard, old ice, and they're really solid. And then we have a couple of long screws, and you need a couple long screws because you need to make V-threads for the descent, where you screw these 2 screws into the ice, and then you take them out, and then you have these 2 tunnels, and you can get a piece of webbing through the tunnel there, and then have an anchor. And it's a perfect anchor because all you leave is the hole in the ice. You don't leave anything else there. The rest of the rack, one of the staple items is pitons. Really, pitons only used for protecting climbing in the alpine environment anymore. We don't really use them rock climbing anymore. So I just go with the titanium pins because they're a lot lighter. They're quite a bit more expensive, but they're, I don't know, 20% of the weight of a comparable steel piton. And then I used to have 8 of these. Now I'm down to 5 because I left a few up there in Nanga Parbat. probably the second most important thing in the rock rack is the nuts. We started with 8 nuts. It's good to have a selection of nuts. They're super versatile. They're cheap if you have to rappel off of them. And then cams. And cams are probably the least useful item on the rock rack for alpine climbing, because if there's any ice in the cracks, they'll slip and they won't really work if the cracks have any verglass in them or around them. So, but there is a certain size range from sort of fingers to hands where nothing else really works, and you got to have a few. We carried these 3 because these are really common sizes, and this one's got a really big expansion range for not very much weight. Then carabiners, mostly I'll use the lightest carabiners I can get that are full strength. And here I've got some of the heavier ones because my light ones are all left up there on the Rupal face because we left them on the rappels. Then T-blocks are a really useful thing to help make running belays a lot safer. You can leave these on a piece of gear, and then the rope running between you and your partner, you can climb with that as a running belay, and it protects the leader from a possible jerk if the second falls off. Then belay devices. I'm a really big proponent of a plaquette style belay device, and this is a good all-around lightweight one that's also a good rappel device. And for carabiners, what I'll do is I'll have one super light carabiner, the lightest locking I can find, and that attaches the plaquette to the anchor. And then I'll have one carabiner that's usually a little heavy, but I like one that's made out of the big round bar stock, and that allows the rope to feed around this carabiner. It feeds a lot more smoothly over a round bar stock than it does over a hot forged biner. So you have to pay because you are using a little bit heavier carabiner in the beginning, but you save so much energy because you're having to feed the rope over that, and if you feed smoothly, you're saving a lot of energy over all that time. The always useful cordelette, always have 1 or 2 pieces of 15 feet of 5 or 6 mil cord. If it's a real sharp rock, I might go with 7 mil, but most of the time I'm using 6. And then runners. I mean, runners are one of the most important things on your rack. We don't use quick draws alpine climbing very much. Mostly I use the lightest single runners I can get. I usually carry about a dozen of these, and then I usually carry about 2 double runners. And I'll make sure the double runners are different color from the other ones so I can quickly identify them on my rack. And the other thing I'll do is when I rack these, I'll rack them like this with the carabiner clipped. And then no matter what I put on, over this, I can, if I've got, some other runners, and you're gonna have carabiners on there, you might have your rack on there, you might even put your pack on there, but you can always get to this at the bottom and put that on first, so it's at the bottom, but you can always just unclip that carabiner and pull it out and have access to it when you get to the point where you need that double runner. And that's just a handy way to keep from getting so tangled up. There's always so much going on. So much of technical alpine climbing is just a battle of logistics, making sure all the systems work. And part of that is having a harness. For me, I like a harness that has full array of sort of gear loops and a haul loop so that I can stay organized. And I always rack the same way. I always know that my belay device is right there on the last one on my right side. I always know my nuts are here, and I know my carabiners are here, and then I know my cams are over here, my screws are in the front. So I have that always the same. I don't ever have to think about doing it. Helmet needs to be, in the alpine anyway, it needs to be a good hard shell helmet, because mostly what you're worried about is rock fall. You're not so much worried about hitting your head on the way down when you fall. You're worried about the impact of a flying object. So you need to have a good hard shell helmet. Boots are important. When you're alpine climbing, they're almost always going to be double boots unless you're on a shorter 1 or 2 day route. And that's important because you need to be able to take the liner out, you need to put it in your jacket, or you need to put it in your sleeping bag somehow. over the stove, whatever, and get it dry. And then I'm really fastidious, even with the shell part of my boot. I'll clean all the snow off of this, and I'll clean the snow out of the laces, and I'll make sure that this is like completely clean before I go to sleep. And then I'll also put that in my bivy sack or in the tent or something to protect it, because it's important to have your feet as warm and dry as possible. If not, you know, you can easily have problems from that just because you didn't take sort of preventative care along the way. Now, camping stuff, one of the most important things is a tent, and often I'll go for a really lightweight, like 2-pound bivy tent, because it gives me so many options, and I can get fully out of the weather. Sometimes I might take just a tarp or bivy sacks or something like that, but most of the time I'm going to take a tent because it gives me just so many more options. The more technical the route is, the harder the climbing, the more I'm going to lean towards going towards a tarp or something, or bivy sacks. But in a place like Nanga Parbat, we found places to set up the tent every night, and that made a huge difference in our ability to rest and recover. And it's warmer and so many things. So it's really good to have a light tent. Sleeping bag. When we wanted to climb this route, and this is something I've worked on for the last few years, is trying to find a really lightweight sleeping bag that 2 people can get into. And last year I built my own 2-person sleeping bag that's right in this stuff sack. And what it is it's the same insulation that we use in our DOS parka, 2 layers of it just on the top, nothing on the bottom, and the pads go on the bottom, and 2 people get in there. And you can stay warm because of the shared body heat, and you can still have room for things like your inner boots and water bottles so they don't freeze at night and stuff. But you have one package like this, so when you pack all this stuff, that makes a huge difference in volume and weight and how much you have to climb with. So that really makes a difference, having a lightweight sleeping bag. Then the rest of the stuff, you know, camping gear, I think of my sleeping bag, and then I think of my sleeping pad. And I go with a 3/4 length inflatable pad, and I can blow this up really hard, and I get a lot of good insulation out of that. But it's not as comfortable as I blow it up just a little bit, make it soft. But this is a good pad, and then it's also really compact, and I can put it in my pack. And I don't like having a big foam pad on the outside of my pack because it catches on stuff and gets in the way. And this I can just roll up, and I can put a rubber band around it, and I can always find a place for that in my backpack. One of the other things that's always a battle when you're trying to figure out what to take and what not to take is a stove. And it's the whole system, really. You have the choice, first of all, between titanium and aluminum. And one thing to remember, titanium is lighter to begin with, but aluminum is a lot more efficient at transmitting heat. Titanium is a very bad conductor of heat. So if you're going for more than a couple of days, you're probably going to want to go with a lightweight aluminum pot because you're going to save fuel. But if you're just going for a night or two, titanium is probably going to be your friend because it just weighs less to begin with, and you're not so concerned about efficiency of the fuel. One thing I like on longer trips, more than 2 or 3 nights, is having this little heat exchanger that I made. And the commercial heat exchangers that were available were a little bulky and a little bit just heavy, I guess. And so this is a simple, but in my own little backyard tests, this makes a huge difference in the efficiency of my cooking setup in really cold temperatures, because it keeps the heat in around the sides of the pot and makes my pot a lot more efficient place to melt snow. A windscreen is super critical. A really lightweight little pot grip, I think, is critical, because otherwise you're using your gloves and your gloves get wet, or you're trying to use your bare hand and you're grabbing it and you burn yourself and you spill, and it's just important not to spill that water. It's really valuable stuff. You earn every bit of it you make, so both in time and fuel. So it's important to have that, even though it weighs a little bit. And then the last thing is the stove itself. And in Asia, you can't get white gas. You have to use a propane butane canister stove. And so this is one I've found that works the best. And the reason is that the stove is really stable and low. And then this, I can keep the canister goes on here, and I can keep it warm. And I can also, once this gets hot, I can turn this canister upside down, and then I can, the liquid fuel will come out from the bottom of the canister and it will vaporize when it comes through this tube here, and that is a lot more efficient and burns a lot hotter than when you take the vaporized fuel from the top of the canister. So that's a really good little secret trick that makes a big difference in your overall efficiency. Then, you know, just a few basic things. You got to have really good sunglasses that block all the UV, and dark is good at altitude. And then I almost always carry a pair of goggles. I always carry a pair of yellow lens goggles. Same reason I carry an extra pair of mittens or gloves a lot, because if I can see in bad weather, I can get myself down, and that can make a huge difference, because obviously I'm not really prepared to like endure a lot of really bad weather. If it gets bad, I just need to be able to get out of there, and these help me get out of there if I need to. And then one thing that's important to a lot of us is just having a good little camera. And for me, it's still a good little slide film camera beats any kind of digital you can get. It's just much more reliable. The batteries last a lot longer. You only need one tiny little battery, and that'll last like a whole expedition. And you get really, you know, there's nothing better in terms of quality than slide film in this size package. So until they come up with a little digital that's this small and this reliable, I'm going to stick with this. And one thing I find is I like the really wide angle lens for climbing action, because you're always so close to your partner. It's nice to have the wide angle. And you know, one thing, if you find that you do get to go do, you know, some kind of route like a Nanga Parbat, if you're lucky enough, when you come back, they'll give you the golden ice axe. So that's kind of a nice thing too. Extra bonus. It's kind of heavy though.